Listen, I'm gonna tell you about something I saw happen once. Something that made me understand that people are a lot like motorcycles. Sometimes it takes somebody actually stopping to notice that they're broken before anything gets fixed. And this story, it starts with a woman who'd been running on empty for so long she didn't even remember what a full tank felt like. There's a street on the east side of town, the kind that time forgot. You've probably driven past it 100 times without really seeing it. The houses are just old enough to be tired, yards just overgrown enough that the neighbors stopped commenting. There's one house on that street, end of a quiet block, set back from the road just enough that you could drive past without really noticing. But if you looked close, if you stopped for even 30 seconds and actually saw what you were looking at, you'd see a woman on that porch. Every day, same time, same spot, just sitting there with cats. The woman had been alone for longer than she wanted to admit. I'm not talking about the kind of alone where you've got a house full of people, but nobody's really paying attention to you. I'm talking about real alone, the kind where the phone doesn't ring, where the mail's just bills and catalogs for things you'll never buy, where you wake up in the morning and the first voice you hear is your own, saying something stupid like, "Well, here we go again." She'd been that alone for years, long enough that she stopped counting, long enough that she stopped expecting anything different. The cats, though, they showed up. I don't know if you've ever paid attention to how strays work. They've got their own code, you know? They don't expect much. They don't ask a whole lot of questions. They just know if you've got food and you're not gonna hurt them, then maybe, just maybe, they'll stick around. This woman had learned that lesson somewhere along the way. Maybe it was after her husband died. Maybe it was when her kids stopped visiting as much as they said they would. Doesn't really matter when it happened. What matters is that somewhere in those years of quiet, she'd become the person the cats came to see. She fed them from her own plate. Let that one sit for a second. She was rationing her own food so that the animals would have something to eat, because at least they showed up. At least they came around. There were about 7 of them, I learned later. 7 strays that had a routine just like she did. She'd named them too, even though they couldn't answer to the names. There was Marmalade, the orange tabby I mentioned. There was Shadow, black as motor oil. There were the 3 calicos she called Patches, Smokey, and Little Bit. And then there were the 2 newest ones, still pretty skittish, that she called Tom and Ginger, like they were characters in some old movie. You could hear her talking to them sometimes, neighbors said, having whole conversations with creatures that couldn't talk back. She'd sit on that porch and tell them about her day, what she'd had for lunch, whether the weather might change. I'd sit there and think about how a person knows they've hit a certain kind of loneliness when a cat becomes your primary conversation partner. But I guess when nobody else is listening, a purring cat is as close to a conversation as you're gonna get. It's better than silence. It's better than being invisible. The thing about that porch was that it was falling apart. The railing had started to rot some years back, and wood rot doesn't wait around. It just keeps working, spreading like the disease it is, eating away at the structure until something gives. The porch boards had softened in places, and there was a section where the paint was so old it was coming off in sheets, leaving bare wood that had started to splinter. The roof over the porch wasn't in much better shape. You could see where water had been getting in, staining the overhang with dark patches, weakening joints that were already tired from bearing the weight of too many years. Some of the shingles were curled or missing entirely, and you could see the wood underneath, weathered and compromised. But she still sat out there. Every day she still sat out there with the cats, because inside was just more of the same empty. The convoy came through on a Tuesday in late September, and let me tell you something about why they noticed her at all. You've got these groups of riders, especially the older ones, the ones who've been doing this for decades. They tend to ride together when they're heading somewhere. Safety in numbers, brotherhood in the saddle, All those things that make sense when you've spent enough time on the road. This group was maybe 15 riders, mixed ages, mixed backgrounds, but all of them running the same code. The code that says, when you see something wrong, you don't just ride past it. You stop, you investigate, you do something about it. That's the road teaching you something. It teaches you that the world breaks things constantly, and the only way any of it survives is if people who notice actually do something about it, instead of just shaking their head and moving on. The convoy leader was a man in his mid-50s named Preston. Good-looking guy in that weathered way that comes from decades of sun and wind on your face. He had that stillness about him that you only get when you've made a lot of serious decisions and you know how to live with them. The kind of guy who wouldn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. He was riding second position in the convoy, near the rear, where he could keep an eye on the group when he noticed her. Just noticed her sitting there, noticed something about the way she was moving, or maybe not moving. The way her hand was just resting on one of the cats instead of actually petting it. The kind of still that isn't peaceful. The kind of still that's exhaustion. The kind of still that's been going on for so long, the person doesn't even remember what moving feels like. Preston raised his hand, and the convoy slowed. They didn't stop dead in the road like it was an emergency. They just gradually reduced speed, downshifting, the sound of all those engines backing off in a kind of synchronized way that comes from riding together for years. One by one, the riders started pulling over, parking their bikes on the wide shoulder in front of that house. 15 motorcycles, all that chrome and leather and engine noise, just came to a stop right there. The smell hit you first, that gasoline and hot engine smell, mixed with the dusty smell of brakes cooling down. Some of the cats scattered immediately, which was natural. Animals don't like sudden changes, don't like that kind of noise and vibration, but a couple of them just watched. The woman didn't move much. She turned her head. She watched them. Her hand stopped moving on Marmalade's fur, and I think, just for a second, she probably thought about what was about to happen, and whether she should be scared or hopeful or what. Preston climbed off his bike slow, the way you do when you've spent 40 years riding and your knees remind you of it every single time. He pulled off his helmet, shook out his gray hair, looked at the porch like he was reading it the way some people read faces. He had gray in his hair, lines deep around his eyes, and he was looking at her the way you look at something you don't quite understand yet. He walked up to the edge of the porch, not stepping up onto it, just standing at ground level where she could see all of him at once. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was quiet, which somehow made it more powerful than if he'd shouted. "I'm Preston. We're just passing through, but I noticed you sitting here. I noticed you, and I noticed something about the way you were sitting. How long has it been since anybody actually checked on you? Not asked in passing, actually stopped to check." She didn't answer right away. Her hand was still on the cat. Marmalade, the orange tabby. The one that had been coming around the longest, the one she'd saved during that real cold snap 3 winters back when the other strays had mostly found other places to shelter. She looked at Preston like she was trying to figure out if this was real or just her mind playing tricks on a lonely day. Her eyes were the color of faded denim, and there was something in them that said she'd stopped expecting good things a long time ago. "A long time," she said finally. Her voice was small, the kind of small that comes from disuse. "A long time since anybody stopped. It's been years, I think. Years since I had a real conversation with someone who wasn't a cat." That's when it shifted. That's when Preston looked at the other riders who'd come up behind him, and something passed between them without words. The kind of understanding that people who live by a code develop without needing to explain it. He turned back to the woman. "I'd like to come up on your porch for a minute, if that's okay. And maybe a couple of my friends. We're not here to hurt anything or take anything. We're not here to judge you or look down on you. We just want to see if you need help with something. That's all." She nodded slowly, and Preston went up those rotting porch steps, careful, testing each one before he put his full weight on it. You could hear the wood creak under him, could see how much give there was in some of the boards. He was picking his footsteps like he was walking through broken glass. One of the other riders, a younger guy named Devon, with kind eyes behind his beard and tattoos running down both arms like story marks, went over to an older biker named Carson. Carson was the convoy's mechanic, the one who knew how to fix things, the one who could look at something broken and see what it needed without any explanation. Preston gestured for him to come over, and Carson brought 2 others with him, including a woman named Joelle, who specialized in carpentry work and had been doing that trade for 30 years. What they saw on that porch made their jaws tighten. They could see through to the house from where they stood. The interior was clean, at least. She'd kept it tidy the way you do when you take pride, even when nobody's watching, even when the only people who might see it are cats. But it was empty. Sparse. The living room had a television from about 2 decades ago, a boxy thing that looked like it still worked, and one chair positioned right in front of it, where everything in the house said she spent all her time. That chair had a worn spot on the cushion, the fabric faded from years of the same person sitting in the same spot. The kitchen, visible from the front door, had cupboards that were clearly mostly bare. One of them was open slightly, and through the crack you could see maybe 3 cans of vegetables and a box of crackers that looked about half empty. The counters were clean but sparse, just a coffee maker and a dish rack with maybe 2 plates in it. What struck them most was the cat food situation. There were regular tins meant for humans, open and partially eaten, set out in small dishes on the kitchen floor alongside actual cat food. But there wasn't much of either. The human food dishes had maybe 2 spoonfuls of something that might have been green beans or possibly creamed corn. She was splitting her meals with the cats, stretching everything as far as it'd go. The cat food bowls had maybe half a cup each. Someone was running on fumes, and that someone wasn't being kind to themselves in the process. "How long have you been here?" Preston asked. Not unkind, just direct. The kind of direct that comes from someone used to asking hard questions and hearing harder answers. 43 years, she said. Her name was Betty, and she spoke like she was confessing something. "Lived here with my husband for 28 of them. He passed. Kids moved away. One daughter calls sometimes, on my birthday, maybe Christmas. The others, well, they've got their own lives, I suppose. They've got families and jobs and all those things that keep people busy. I understand it. I do. You can't expect people to think about you when they've got their own lives filling up all their time." Preston nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. He'd probably met people like her before. People the world just sort of moved past. People who became invisible because they weren't part of the active, moving, productive world anymore. People who'd been erased slowly, imperceptibly, until they were just fixtures in their own lives. "When's the last time you had somebody help you with maintenance around the place?" Preston asked. "The porch, the roof, things like that? When's the last time someone came over and helped you?" "Oh, years," she said. "Years and years. I've made do, fixed what I could myself, learned some things over the time. But there's only so much one person can do, you know? And I'm not as strong as I used to be. Some things are just beyond what I can manage." But looking at the porch, at the way the wood had separated in places, at the obvious structural issues, it was obvious she hadn't been able to do much. The roof was a different kind of concern, though, a more pressing one. Preston went inside with her permission, and what he found was water damage in 2 of the bedrooms. The ceiling in one room was already showing a soft spot, a bulge in the drywall like something was about to break through. The kind that could come down if a heavy rain hit it wrong. You could smell the moisture in there, that particular smell of old water damage, kind of musty and sad. The foundation wasn't great. The wiring looked original to the house, maybe 60 years old, cloth-covered wiring that was a fire hazard just sitting there in the walls. When he came back out, his face was serious in a way that said this was bigger than just a quick repair job. "What's your situation like?" he asked. "And I mean financially. Can you afford to get some of this work done? Be straight with me." She was quiet for a long time. Then she told him. She had her Social Security check, which came in on the 3rd of every month and amounted to about $1,200. That was enough to get by, mostly. Enough for utilities, which ran higher in winter, and basic food and her cat's food, or trying to. She'd never asked her kids for help. She wouldn't. That was pride, or stubbornness, or both. She'd never been the kind of person who asked for things. She'd always taken care of herself, always paid her own way, always made it work somehow. It was just that taking care of yourself gets harder the older you get, and she was old now. She was very old and alone, and she couldn't fix a roof or replace rotting porch boards or do any of the 100 things that needed doing. She couldn't afford to hire someone to do it either, so she just didn't. Preston stood there on that porch, surrounded by his convoy, and he made a decision, not alone. He turned to the riders behind him, and he started assigning tasks like he'd been doing this his whole life. Carson and Joelle would assess what the house needed in terms of immediate structural repair, top priority being the roof and the foundation, secondary priority being the wiring. Devon would go with Preston to talk to the veterinarian about getting the cats checked out and figured out, because some of those strays needed attention too, needed vaccines and flea treatment and a real examination. 2 other riders named Marcus and Trey would take a trip to the grocery store and bring back real food, good food, because she wasn't feeding the cats out of her meals anymore once they were done. No more splitting cans of vegetables. No more stretching everything so thin it was transparent. "What's your name?" Preston asked, and I think it mattered to him, knowing her name, making her into a person instead of just a situation. "Betty," she said. "My name is Betty. Betty Morse." Preston nodded, committing that to memory. "Okay, Betty, here's what's going to happen. We're going to take a few hours today and make sure your house is safe. We're going to walk through it, we're going to look at what you need, and we're going to make a plan. Tomorrow, we're coming back with materials. We're going to fix your porch, patch your roof, make sure you're secure for winter and beyond. We're going to do it right, and we're not going to take money for it, because this is what you do. You see somebody who needs help, you help them. That's the rule. That's always been the rule. You don't ride past. You don't pretend you didn't see. You stop and you help. That's the code." Betty's eyes got wet, but she didn't cry. She was past crying, maybe, or the tears wouldn't come right away. Instead, she just nodded and said thank you, and it was like she was testing the words to make sure they still worked right, like it had been so long since she'd had reason to say thank you to a person that she needed to practice the sounds of it. The convoy didn't all stay. After the assessment was done and the supply run was made, most of them headed out. They had places to be, people depending on them, rides they'd committed to finishing. But Preston stayed, and Carson, who'd taken the lead on the structural inspection, and Joelle, whose hands were already itching to start the carpentry work, and Marcus and Trey. 5 of them stayed. They ordered pizza because nobody wanted to just leave her cooking dinner alone, and besides, none of them wanted to spend the evening sitting in a house that empty, eating food split between 7 cats. They sat on the porch with her in the evening as the light turned golden and then purple, and they talked. Not about deep things, just normal conversation. Things that normal people talk about when they're sitting together and the sun's going down. Marcus asked her about her cats, really asked her, like he actually wanted to know. And Betty told him names and stories about each one. Marmalade, the orange tabby, who'd come to her in the middle of a winter storm looking half dead and had stayed ever since. Shadow, who was nervous and only came out at certain times, who she'd rescued from under the porch where he'd gotten himself stuck. The three Calicos, Patches and Smokey and Little Bit, who'd arrived together and seemed to be a family unit, who'd stick together even when they scattered. Tom and Ginger, who were still the wildest of the bunch, still had that feral look even after months of being fed, but who were starting to warm to her, who were starting to understand that coming to her house meant food and safety. Marcus listened like it mattered, because to him, it did. "You've named all of them," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Betty said. "Names make them individuals, you know? Made me feel like I actually knew them, like they had personalities and histories, like they were real to me in a way that mattered." "They are real," Devon said. He was the younger one, the one with kind eyes. "And they mattered enough that you fed them from your own plate. You cared about them when nobody was caring about you. That's not nothing. That's something." "The thing people don't understand," Preston said to Betty, and he was looking out at the street like he was talking to the whole world, not just her, "is that people only see the leather. They see the bikes and the vests and maybe some tattoos, and they make assumptions about what we are. They think we're rough or unkind or incapable of caring. But what we are is people who stopped. We're people who noticed that something was wrong, and we stopped whatever we were doing to check on it. That's all this is. That's all any of this ever is." Betty nodded, and one of her cats, it was Little Bit, the smallest of the Calicos, came over to Preston, which startled him a little. Cats have instincts about people, I think. They know who's safe. She came right up to him and rubbed against his leg, and Preston reached down, careful, like he was handling something precious, and started petting her. His big tattooed hand, covered in road wear and work scars, was gentle with the small animal. The next day, the convoy came back with supplies, not just a few of them. Seems word had gotten out, and more riders showed up. Some of them had worked in construction. Some had just come to help carry things and hold things in place. Some were retired now, but had spent decades in trades. There was even a young man with a truck full of building materials that he said he could get a discount on, and did Preston want him to just bring what they needed? The work started with the roof, because that's the priority when it comes to saving a house. You can live without a lot of things. You cannot live with water coming in from above. Water's patient, but it's also relentless, and once it gets in, it starts the process of unmaking a house from the inside out. It took 3 days of work. Long days, starting early in the morning when the light was just beginning, ending in the late afternoon when the sun was too low to see what you were doing. During that time, Betty sat in her chair, inside the house most of the time, and the cats moved between the bikers and her, not quite sure what was happening, but pretty sure it was good. They could sense the change, could feel that something positive was happening. Some of the convoy brought their wives, women who'd learned how to work alongside their husbands, or who had their own skills. One brought his daughter, a girl maybe 12 years old, who helped carry supplies and who talked to Betty while the work was happening. They brought food, lots of food, sandwiches and cold drinks and desserts that women had made the night before, sitting in their kitchens, thinking about a stranger they'd never met. They brought tools, the right tools, the kind that made a job efficient instead of a struggle. They brought a kind of purposeful energy that hadn't been in that house for a very long time. On the first day, Carson had the roof exposed by noon. The damage was worse than even Preston had suspected. 2 of the support beams were compromised. The subflooring was warped. But Carson looked at it all like it was a puzzle he'd solved 100 times before, and he started calling out what was needed. Joel was coordinating the crew, making sure everyone had a task, making sure the work stayed organized. By late afternoon, new plywood was being secured, and the first rows of new shingles were being laid. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with the smell of tar and roofing cement. It was the smell of something being saved, I think. On the second day, they tackled the porch. The old railing came off piece by piece, and each piece was like removing a layer of history. Underneath, they found the wood frame, and it was mostly solid, which was a blessing. Joelle directed the replacement, measuring twice and cutting once, her hands moving with practiced precision. She'd been doing this work for 30 years, and it showed. By the end of the day, new railings were standing, solid and straight, painted white, just like Betty asked. The porch floor got reinforced in the weak spots. The soffit got replaced. The overhang got properly waterproofed. The electrician came on the third day, a guy named Frank who'd been riding with the Convoy for 20 years and who'd learned his trade in the military. He brought his apprentice, his own son actually, and they went through that house like they were performing surgery, identifying the dangerous wiring, planning the replacement work, getting permits handled without making Betty worry about the paperwork. Preston covered the materials, and Frank donated the labor, and by the end of the day, the dangerous cloth wiring in the critical circuits had been replaced with modern copper and proper insulation. The veterinarian came by during the second day, a woman named Dr. Reeves, who was friends with some of the bikers, and who'd agreed to do a low-cost clinic right there on Betty's porch. She had her supplies in a travel case, and she went through each cat systematically. Vaccinations, flea treatments, parasite medications. She examined each one carefully, checking for signs of old injuries or ongoing health issues. She found that Marmalade had a heart murmur, nothing immediately life-threatening but something to monitor. She found that Shadow had some old infections in his ears that had partially healed but could use attention. She gave Betty detailed information about getting the cats fixed so there wouldn't be more strays reproducing in the neighborhood. She only charged her cost, and even that Preston covered without asking, sliding her cash and thanking her like she'd just saved lives. Because she had. When the work was mostly done, after the roof was patched and the porch was rebuilt with new boards and new railings that were painted a light blue Betty had always wanted, after the wiring was brought up to code by someone who knew what they were doing, Preston sat down with Betty in her living room. The first time someone had actually sat down with her in that room in longer than she could calculate. "We're going to need to set up a routine," he said. "Because here's the thing about this, Betty. The road teaches you something if you pay attention. You spend enough years on the highway, you understand something about the world. And the main lesson is this. You don't leave people behind. Not once you've stopped. Not once you've decided they matter. So what we're going to do is, people from the Convoy are going to come by. Maybe twice a week, maybe more often, depending on how things are. We're going to make sure you've got food. We're going to make sure the house stays good. We're going to check on those cats. And we're going to sit with you and talk to you and make sure you're not just sitting out on this porch alone anymore. That's the deal. That's the commitment. You with me?" Betty cried then. Proper cried. The kind of crying that comes from deep down, from places you thought had maybe run dry. She cried like she was finally letting out all the loneliness, all the years of quiet, all the time she'd spent just existing instead of living. And a bunch of tattooed bikers on a porch with stray cats were there to witness it and just be present with her. They didn't try to fix it or make it stop. They just sat there and let her feel what she needed to feel. Over the next months, that routine held. Stronger than most relationships, I think. Preston came by most Saturdays, and he'd sit on the porch and drink coffee with Betty, and they'd talk about things. Movies she used to love. Places he'd been on his motorcycle. Nothing heavy. just the texture of normal conversation. Carson would bring his wife, and they'd bring groceries, real groceries, fresh vegetables and meat, and things that weren't just survival rations. Joelle showed up on Thursdays sometimes, and she was teaching Betty about basic home maintenance, though Betty was less inclined to do it herself now that she knew people who'd actually help. It was a shift, that. Betty had spent so long being independent, doing everything herself, that accepting help was like learning a new language. Marcus came by just to sit sometimes. He'd spend hours on that porch, just sitting there with Betty and the cats. They'd play cards occasionally, or just sit in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Devin brought his daughter once, and the girl was delighted by the cats and spent 2 hours just playing with them while Betty and Devin talked about books. Turns out, Devin was a reader, and Betty had a whole shelf of books that nobody had asked her about in decades. They started exchanging recommendations, and he started bringing her new books every other week. In November, a younger writer named Jesse showed up with his girlfriend, and together they organized a Thanksgiving dinner right there at Betty's house. They cooked it all from scratch, and the whole place smelled like roasting turkey and herbs and cinnamon. Betty sat in her kitchen while other people worked in it, and for the first time in maybe 20 years, her kitchen was a place where things were happening, where people were doing things because they cared about her. They ate together, 12 of them, packed around her little table and sitting on folding chairs, and Betty sat at the head like she was the honored guest, because she was. The house got better. New windows got installed in November, and the light changed inside, became brighter and warmer. The garden got cleared in the spring, and someone planted a small flower bed right near the porch. Someone painted the porch a light blue color that Betty had always wanted, and it came out perfect, like something from a magazine. The interior walls got a fresh coat of paint in pale yellows and soft creams, and suddenly the house looked like a place where someone lived a life, not just existed in it. They put new linoleum in the kitchen, and they upgraded the ancient water heater. They put in a small shelf specifically for Betty's cat food and supplies, and they kept it stocked weekly. The cats changed too. Proper fed, vaccinated, some of them fixed, they settled in like they'd never been strays at all. They became less wild. They became more like pets than survivors. Marmalade started sleeping on Betty's bed at night. Shadow started coming out in daylight, started seeking out attention instead of avoiding it. The calicos became like a little furry committee, always around when Betty was doing anything, always interested in her day. Even Tom and Ginger, the wildest ones, started acting like they'd been domestic cats their whole lives, started purring when Betty petted them, started seeking her out. Betty stopped rationing her own food. She started eating proper meals, real meals, with vegetables and protein and calories enough to sustain her. She stopped looking like she was existing on the edge of something. When you looked at her now, you could see the person under the years of hardship. You could see her. That's what that does, attention. That's what actual care and connection does to a person. It restores them. It brings them back. Preston told me something toward the end of that first winter. We were having coffee, just the two of us at a diner down the street, and I asked him why he'd stopped that day. Why he'd made that decision to slow the convoy and check on her. Why he'd committed his time and his people to someone he'd never met. Because we could, he said. Because I had 15 people on bikes who could afford to spend a few hours helping somebody. Because I looked at her and I saw my mother, you know? I saw what could happen to somebody when the world just passes them by, when nobody's paying attention, when they become invisible, and because stopping is what you do. We spent all those years riding past people. I'm not doing that anymore. Life's too short to be that numb to what's happening around you. I asked him if he felt like a hero. He looked at me like I'd asked something stupid, and maybe I had. No, he said. A hero is somebody who does something extraordinary. I just stopped. I just looked at something that was broken, and I fixed it with my friends. That's not heroic. That's just what you're supposed to do. That's baseline. That's what people should be doing all the time. The fact that it's remarkable now just tells you something about how far we've all slid. But here's what I know about this story that maybe Preston didn't want to admit. In stopping, in seeing Betty, in deciding that she mattered enough to change his route for, Preston and that convoy didn't just change Betty's life, they changed their own too. Because once you see somebody, once you decide they matter, you can't really unsee them. You can't go back to just riding past. You're connected to them now. That's a burden and a privilege both, and once you understand that, you can't live the same way you were living before. Preston knows that. They all know that now. And the most important thing about what happened here isn't that a house got fixed, or that a woman got fed, or that stray cats got veterinary care and proper nutrition, though all of those things matter. The most important thing is that somebody stopped being invisible. Somebody stopped being alone. Somebody learned that there were people in the world who would check on her, who would come back, who would keep coming back no matter what. That's a different kind of repair, and it takes longer to fix, but it's the most important one. Betty still sits on that porch sometimes, but she doesn't sit alone anymore. There's usually someone there. Marmalade's almost always with her, growing older but content, purring in the afternoon sun. Shadow's there too, stretched out on the arm of her chair. The calicos are somewhere underfoot. Even Tom and Ginger, those wild ones, they come back regular. And the cats, they still come around. The strays, I mean. Word must have gotten out in whatever way cats communicate these things. There's usually a new face or two, and Betty, she feeds them, and she knows that when they get skinny or sick, there are people who'll help. She knows that now. She knows she's not alone. That matters. That matters to me, telling this story, because it reminds me that the road teaches you one thing if you're paying attention. You don't leave people behind. You don't just ride past. You don't pretend you didn't see. You stop, you look, you help, and you keep helping, because that's what the people who matter do. That's the code that makes us human, instead of just creatures moving through space. That's the only rule that really matters.